The ancient Egyptians did not fear death as we do. For them, it was merely a passage to another form of existence, a journey for which they meticulously prepared throughout their lives. Wallace Budge, first complete translator of the Papyrus of Ani. Imagine a document so powerful that it could guarantee your safe passage to the afterlife. A sacred text that, when placed in your tomb, would open the doors to eternity. What would you be willing to pay for such a guarantee? For the ancient Egyptians, the answer was almost everything. The Papyrus of Ani is not just one of the most beautiful examples of the so-called Egyptian Book of the Dead. It is a portal through which we can understand how one of history's greatest civilizations faced humanity's greatest mystery. What happens after death? Discovered in a Theban tomb in 1888 by Sir Ernest Alfred Thompson Wallace Budge, the Papyrus of Ani immediately stood out for its extraordinary length and surprising state of preservation. Measuring over 24 meters long and 37 centimeters high, this document from the 13th century BCE contains not only funerary texts, but also some of the most stunning illustrations ever produced in ancient Egypt. But who was Ani? The hieroglyphs reveal that he was a royal scribe and accountant of the temples of Thebes, a man of privileged position who invested a fortune to ensure his safe passage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. His wife, Tutu, also appears represented in the papyrus, accompanying him on his eternal journey. The Book of the Dead wasn't really a book as we understand it today. It was a collection of approximately 200 spells or magical formulas, each with a specific purpose to assist the deceased in the afterlife. Interestingly, the Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a reference to the belief that the deceased's soul could leave the tomb during the day and return at night. The history of these funerary texts is much older than the Papyrus of Ani itself. The earliest examples appeared in the pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of burial chambers in the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, around 2300 BCE. They later evolved into the coffin texts during the Middle Kingdom, and finally took the form of the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom. What makes the Papyrus of Ani so exceptional is that it wasn't mass-produced like many later examples. Each illustration, each hieroglyph was carefully drawn and painted by hand by highly specialized artists using natural pigments that have maintained their vividness for over 3,000 years. The colors, ochre red, golden yellow, turquoise green, and deep black, still impress us today with their intensity. When Budge acquired the papyrus for the British Museum, he made a controversial decision. He cut the document into 37 sections to facilitate its transport and preservation. Although this practice is condemned by modern archaeological standards, it was thanks to this action that the document has survived to our days in exceptional condition. The fascination that the Papyrus of Ani exerts goes beyond its aesthetic beauty. It offers us a unique glimpse into Egyptian psychology, their complex theology, and their pragmatic approach to death. For the Egyptians, life after death wasn't a matter of abstract faith. It was a concrete reality for which they meticulously prepared. But what exactly does this document contain? What secrets does it hold about the soul's journey through the underworld? And why, even after more than a century of intensive study, are there still passages that defy our understanding? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to face Osiris's tribunal, where your heart would be weighed against the feather of truth? A man's heart is his own God. The conscience must be satisfied at every moment. Do nothing against your conscience. Tariq. Inscription on the Papyrus of Ani. Free translation. The journey described in the Papyrus of Ani begins at the exact moment of death. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, but the beginning of a dangerous crossing through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Unlike the Christian concept of hell, the Duat was not a place of eternal punishment, but a realm of transition, filled with dangers, monsters, and tests that the soul had to overcome. The first sections of the papyrus contain spells to protect the deceased's body. The Egyptians believed that preserving the physical body was essential for survival in the afterlife, hence the practice of mummification. The body, called Khat, served as an anchor for the K, life force, and the Ba, personality, aspects of the soul that would continue to exist after death. One of the most impressive scenes in the Papyrus of Ani shows the deceased and his wife observing their own funeral. This representation perfectly captures the duality of Egyptian belief. The body is dead, but consciousness remains, observing the rituals performed in its honor. It's a visual reminder that, for the Egyptians, death was a transition, not an end. As the soul advances through the Duat, it encounters various deities and supernatural entities. Each encounter represents a test or obstacle that must be overcome through knowledge of the appropriate spells. The Papyrus of Ani contains specific formulas for each situation: how to pass through gates guarded by demons, how to navigate the river of the underworld, how to avoid being devoured by monstrous creatures. A fascinating detail is that many of these spells include precise instructions on how they should be recited, at what moment, and even what gestures should accompany them. Some specify that certain words must be pronounced without anyone seeing or hearing, suggesting an esoteric dimension to these rituals that remains mysterious to this day. The culminating point of this journey, and undoubtedly the most famous scene in the Papyrus of Ani, is the Judgment of Osiris, also known as the Weighing of the Heart. This elaborate illustration occupies an entire section of the papyrus and represents the decisive moment in the deceased's journey. At the center of the scene, we see a scale. On one plate is Ani's heart, considered by the Egyptians as the center of consciousness and morality. On the other plate, the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, adjusts the scale, while Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, records the result. Observing everything is Osiris, the god of the underworld, seated on his throne. Near the scale waits a terrifying hybrid creature, Amit, the devourer of the dead, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. If Ani's heart weighed more than the feather, indicating a life of sins and injustices, Amit would devour it, condemning him to the second death, the complete annihilation of the soul. This was the only form of eternal damnation in Egyptian theology. Not perpetual suffering, but the absolute end of existence. Chapter 1. 125 of the Book of the Dead, reproduced in the Papyrus of Ani, contains the famous negative confession, a list of 42 sins that the deceased denies having committed. Before 42 divine judges, Ani declares, "I have not committed iniquity against men. I have not mistreated animals. I have not blasphemed against the gods," and so on. This list offers us a fascinating glimpse into Egyptian morality, revealing which behaviors were considered serious transgressions. What makes the Papyrus of Ani particularly valuable is that it includes not only the standard text of this confession, but also additional glosses and comments that clarify its meaning. Some of these comments contain surprisingly sophisticated philosophical concepts about the nature of truth and justice. If the heart was in balance with the feather of Maat, the deceased would be declared true of voice, Makaru in ancient Egyptian, and could proceed to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. There, Ani would enjoy an idealized existence, similar to earthly life, but without suffering, disease, or death. But what happened if the scale tipped slightly to one side or the other? Were there gradations of reward or punishment? And why do some scholars believe that the judgment of Osiris influenced later concepts of divine judgment in other religions? What would you do if you had only one chance to prove your innocence before the gods? The Book of the Dead is not just a religious text. It is a work of art that reveals the soul of a civilization. Each line, each figure, each color was chosen not only for its symbolic meaning, but also for its ability to invoke the divine through beauty. Zahi Hawass, renowned Egyptologist. The artistic dimension of the Papyrus of Ani transcends its religious function. We are looking at one of the most refined expressions of Egyptian art, created during a period when the New Kingdom was reaching its cultural zenith. Each vignette, each hieroglyph, was executed with technical mastery and deep symbolic understanding. The illustrations in the papyrus follow artistic conventions established centuries earlier, but also reveal the hand of an exceptional artist. Human figures are represented in the characteristic Egyptian posture: head and legs in profile, eyes and torso frontal. This was not a technical limitation, as some erroneously assume, but a deliberate choice to show each part of the body in its most recognizable and significant angle. The color palette used in the Papyrus of Ani is particularly notable. The ochre red, extracted from ferrous minerals, was associated with the god Seth and the desert. Blue and green, obtained from malachite and other copper minerals, symbolized life, regeneration, and the Nile. Golden yellow, derived from gold or yellow ochres, represented the flesh of the gods and eternity. Black, made from charcoal, evoked the fertility of the soil after the annual flooding of the Nile. Each color carried multiple meanings, and their application followed strict rules. For example, Osiris is always represented with green or black skin, symbolizing resurrection and fertility. Anubis is invariably black, a color associated with mummification and the underworld. These chromatic conventions were not arbitrary, but part of a complex system of visual communication that reinforced theological concepts. A fascinating aspect of the Papyrus of Ani is the representation of Ani himself and his wife, Tutu. They appear in various scenes, always dressed in elegant clothes and elaborate adornments, indicating their high social status. Interestingly, in some vignettes, Ani is shown with lighter skin than normal, possibly to indicate his transition to the divine state. This subtle detail reveals how Egyptian artists manipulated visual conventions to convey abstract concepts. The vignettes illustrating the spells are not mere decorations. They are an integral part of the magical power of the text. The Egyptians believed in the principle of Sekhmet Sahu, making spiritual, the idea that representing something visually conferred real existence on the spiritual plane. Thus, each illustration not only described a scene, but made it magically effective in the afterlife. One of the most enigmatic vignettes shows Ani and Tutu kneeling before an offering table, with hands raised in adoration to a series of deities. Above them, a row of seemingly abstract symbols represents the celestial fields. These symbols, which appear as simple geometric patterns to modern eyes, were actually precise cosmic maps intended to guide the soul in its navigation through the night sky. The Papyrus of Ani also contains one of the earliest known representations of the Egyptian tree of life, a sacred sycamore from which the goddess Nut, Sky, emerges to offer water and food to the deceased. This powerful image influenced religious iconographies throughout the ancient Mediterranean and possibly even the biblical concept of the tree of life. Particularly intriguing is the representation of Ani's Ba, his mobile soul, usually illustrated as a bird with a human head. In a touching scene, the Ba returns to the tomb at dusk to reunite with the mummy. This vignette perfectly captures the Egyptian belief in the continuity between life and death, and in the soul's ability to transit between worlds. The hieroglyphs accompanying the illustrations are, themselves, works of art. Each sign was carefully drawn and painted, with meticulous attention to detail. Unlike hieratic writing, a cursive form used in everyday documents, the hieroglyphs in the Papyrus of Ani maintain their complete pictorial form, appropriate for a sacred text. A frequently overlooked detail is that the papyrus contains several rubrics, passages written in red ink that provide instructions on how to use the spells. These rubrics reveal the practical dimension of the Book of the Dead. It wasn't just a text to be read, but an operational manual for navigation in the afterlife. The artistic quality of the Papyrus of Ani raises intriguing questions about its production. Who were these anonymous artists capable of such technical refinement? How were they trained? Did they work in workshops associated with temples, or were they independent craftsmen? And how much would it cost, in modern terms, to commission a work of such magnitude? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to see these images not in a silent museum, but in their original context, illuminated by the flickering light of torches, surrounded by clouds of incense, to the sound of funerary chants? For the Egyptians, words were not mere representations of ideas. They were living entities, charged with creative power. To pronounce a name was to invoke its essence. To write a spell was to materialize its magic. Jan Assmann, Egyptologist and cultural theorist. At the heart of the Papyrus of Ani lies a fundamental concept of Egyptian religion. Heka, usually translated as magic, but encompassing much more than that. Heka was the primordial force that allowed the gods to create the universe and that continued to sustain the cosmic order. For the Egyptians, using Heka wasn't superstition, but applying the same creative forces employed by the gods. The Book of the Dead was, essentially, a compendium of Heka, magical knowledge intended to transform the deceased into an Ak, an effective spirit capable of successfully navigating the afterlife. Each spell in the Papyrus of Ani is a precise formula that, when pronounced correctly, activates specific powers. A fascinating aspect of these spells is their rhetorical structure. Many begin with an identification of the deceased with a deity. I am Ra, who rises in the eastern horizon of the sky, or I am Osiris, Lord of eternity. This wasn't a poetic metaphor, but a literal declaration of magical transformation. By pronouncing these words, it was believed that the deceased temporarily merged his identity with that of the invoked god, thus gaining his powers. Chapter 30 of the Papyrus of Ani contains one of the most crucial spells, the formula to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner at the judgment. O my heart, which I had from my mother, my heart of my transformations, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not show hostility against me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. This spell reveals a fascinating tension in the Egyptian mindset. On one hand, the desire to be judged as righteous. On the other, the pragmatic recognition that the heart, the conscience, could reveal inconvenient truths. The solution was not to deny the sins committed, but to magically silence the heart before it could denounce them. The power of words in the Papyrus of Ani is amplified by a linguistic phenomenon known as hieroglyphic wordplay. Ancient Egyptian allowed visual puns where signs could be read in multiple ways, creating layers of meaning. For example, the hieroglyph for life, Ankh, could be visually associated with the rising sun, creating a connection between life and solar rebirth. Many spells contain specific ritual instructions. Chapter 64, for example, must be recited over a scarab of green stone mounted in gold and placed on the chest of the mummy. Others specify body postures, directions the officiant must face, or specific times of day for their recitation. A particularly intriguing detail is the instruction for certain spells to be written with ink made from specific substances: myrrh, quail blood, or even the scribe's own blood. These substances weren't chosen arbitrarily, but for their symbolic associations and perceived magical properties. The Papyrus of Ani also reveals the importance of the name in Egyptian magic. The name, Ren, was considered an essential part of the person, as vital as their physical body or soul. Knowing someone's or something's true name conferred power over that entity. This is why many spells include lists of secret names of deities and demons. Knowing them allowed the deceased to control or neutralize them. This belief explains why Egyptians went to extremes to preserve their names on monuments, and why the practice of erasing someone's name, damnatio memoriae, was considered a terrible punishment, equivalent to a second death. In the Papyrus of Ani, the owner's name is repeated dozens of times, ensuring his eternal survival. Particularly fascinating is chapter 146, which contains a series of gates through which the deceased must pass. Each gate is guarded by three entities: a keeper, a watcher, and an announcer. The deceased must know not only their names, but also the names of the gates themselves. These names are often enigmatic phrases like Lady of Trembling, of Loud Words, who announces storms, who repels attacks. Magical poetry that defies literal translation. Some modern scholars, such as linguist Claude Lévi-Strauss, have suggested that these texts operated at a level beyond the semantic, that the rhythm, sonority, and structure of the words created an almost hypnotic effect, altering the officiant's state of consciousness. This hypothesis gains strength when we consider that many spells contain seemingly meaningless syllables, possibly sonic mantras whose efficacy resided in their acoustic vibration, not their meaning. The Papyrus of Ani also contains formulas for magical transformations. The deceased could transform into a golden falcon, a lotus flower, a heron, or even light itself. These transformations weren't understood as metaphorical, but as literal capabilities that the soul acquired in the afterlife, allowing it to navigate different cosmic regions. What would it be like to possess a document that guaranteed your survival after death? And what if there were words with real power to transform your reality? The Egyptian universe wasn't simply divided between heaven and earth, life and death. It was a continuum of existence, where the visible and invisible, the material and spiritual constantly intertwined, separated only by tenuous veils that appropriate rituals could temporarily push aside. Eric Hornung, specialist in Egyptian religion. The Papyrus of Ani offers us a window into complex Egyptian cosmology, a sophisticated worldview that challenges our modern categories of thought. For the Egyptians, the universe was simultaneously ordered and precarious, sustained by a delicate balance between opposing forces. At the center of this cosmology was the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, truth, justice, and harmony. Ma'at wasn't just a philosophical abstraction, but an active force that needed to be continuously maintained through rituals, offerings, and ethical behavior. Its opposite was Isfet, chaos, falsehood, injustice. Cosmic history was seen as a perpetual struggle between these forces. The Papyrus of Ani represents this duality in various vignettes. Particularly notable is the image of the solar boat navigating through the heavens, with Ra, order, fighting the serpent Apep, chaos. This battle occurred daily, and its outcome was never guaranteed. Each dawn represented a new victory of order over chaos. The geography of the afterlife, as described in the Papyrus of Ani, is surprisingly complex. The Duat, underworld, wasn't a single place, but a vast territory with different regions, each with its own topography, inhabitants, and challenges. There were mountains of fire, lakes of purifying flame, fertile fields, arid deserts, and rivers that had to be navigated. One of the most important regions was the Field of Reeds, Sekhet Aru, the Egyptian paradise. Represented in the Papyrus of Ani as an idealized agricultural landscape with irrigation canals and abundant fields, this was the final destination of the justified. Interestingly, even in this paradise, the deceased had to work, cultivating fields and making offerings to the gods. The difference was that this work was performed without fatigue or suffering. The Papyrus of Ani contains a detailed map of this realm, one of the first cartographic representations of the afterlife in human history. This map wasn't merely illustrative, but functional, intended to guide the deceased in their post-mortem navigation. It includes specific landmarks, names of regions, and even stellar coordinates for night navigation. The Egyptian conception of time in the afterlife was particularly fascinating. There were two types of time: jet, static, unchanging eternity, and nehe, cyclical eternity, perpetual renewal. The deceased participated in both, remaining unchanging like Osiris, and cyclically renewing like Ra. This temporal duality is represented in the Papyrus of Ani through symbols such as the circle, Nehe, and the Djed pillar, Dayet. A frequently misunderstood aspect of Egyptian religion is the nature of its immortality. Unlike the Christian conception of an eternal and unchanging soul, the Egyptians saw post-mortem survival as conditional and dependent on adequate preparation. Without the correct rituals, without knowledge of the appropriate spells, the soul could suffer the second death, complete annihilation. The Papyrus of Ani contains specific spells to avoid this second death. Chapter 44, for example, is titled Formula for Not Dying Again in the Realm of the Dead. This text reveals the underlying anxiety of the elaborate Egyptian funerary preparation, the fear that, even after overcoming physical death, spiritual existence could still be lost. Particularly intriguing is the Egyptian conception of spiritual anatomy. The human being didn't consist only of body and soul, but of multiple components: the Ka, life force; the Ba, mobile personality; the Akh, transfigured spirit; the Shuyet, shadow; the Ren, name; and the Ib, heart-mind. Each of these elements had its own destiny after death and required specific care. The Papyrus of Ani illustrates how these components interacted in the afterlife. For example, the Ba, represented as a bird with a human head, could leave the tomb during the day to visit the world of the living, but needed to return to the mummy at night to regenerate. This conception explains why preserving the body through mummification was so crucial. Without an intact body, the Ba would have nowhere to land. A fascinating concept mentioned in the Papyrus of Ani is that of coming forth by voice, the idea that words pronounced with the correct intonation could materialize in the afterlife. This belief explains the emphasis on precise recitation of spells and suggests a conception of the afterlife as a realm where thought and reality weren't clearly distinct. The Papyrus of Ani also reveals the belief in the continuation of family relationships after death. Ani and his wife, Tutu, are consistently represented together, suggesting that the matrimonial bond transcended death. Other funerary texts mention reunions with parents, children, and ancestors in the afterlife, indicating that the Egyptians saw life after death not as a solitary existence, but as a continuation of community. This worldview, so different from our modern conception, raises fascinating questions. What would it be like to live in a society where the boundary between life and death was seen as permeable? where the invisible was considered as real as the visible, and where preparation for the afterlife was the central project of existence. If we could adopt, for a moment, the perspective of an ancient Egyptian, how would it transform our relationship with death, with time, and with the ultimate meaning of our lives? The Book of the Dead is not just an artifact of an extinct civilization. It is a mirror in which each generation sees reflected its own anxieties about death and its hopes for transcendence. We continue to read it not only to understand the ancient Egyptians, but to understand ourselves. Salima Ikram, contemporary Egyptologist. When Wallace Budge brought the Papyrus of Ani to London in 1888, he could not have imagined the lasting impact this document would have on Western culture. His first complete translation, published in 1894, coincided with a wave of Egyptomania sweeping across Europe and America, fueled by sensational archaeological discoveries and fascination with the occult. The Book of the Dead quickly transcended academic circles to influence art, literature, cinema, and even modern spiritual movements. Its iconic images, particularly the scene of the Judgment of Osiris, have been appropriated, reinterpreted, and reimagined countless times, becoming part of the visual vocabulary of popular culture. Esoteric societies such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn incorporated elements of the Book of the Dead into their rituals, seeing in it not just a historical artifact, but a repository of timeless magical wisdom. Aleister Crowley, notorious British occultist, based part of his magical system on concepts derived from Egyptian funerary texts, reinterpreted through a modern lens. In literature, authors such as H.P. Lovecraft, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Agatha Christie incorporated elements of the Book of the Dead into their works, often as symbols of forbidden knowledge or portals to unknown dimensions. Cinema, from the earliest versions of The Mummy to contemporary productions like Stargate, has explored the aesthetics and mythology of ancient Egypt, often with direct references to the Papyrus of Ani and its iconic illustrations. But the legacy of the Papyrus of Ani goes far beyond its cultural influence. For Egyptologists, it continues to be an invaluable primary source, not only for the study of funerary religion, but also for understanding the language, art, and social structure of New Kingdom Egypt. Its exceptional preservation allows detailed analyses of calligraphy techniques, pigment composition, and papyrus production methods that would be impossible with less complete examples. In recent years, advanced technologies have revealed aspects of the Papyrus of Ani that remained hidden for millennia. Multispectral photography has detected pigments invisible to the naked eye and revealed corrections made by the original scribes. Chemical analyses have identified the exact composition of the inks, allowing researchers to trace their geographical origins and reconstruct ancient trade routes. Particularly fascinating was the discovery, through digital microscopy, of fingerprints preserved in the margins of the papyrus, tangible traces of the anonymous craftsman who created this masterpiece more than 3,000 years ago. These fingerprints humanize the document in a deeply moving way, reminding us that behind this sacred text were real people with hopes, fears, and beliefs. Despite these technological advances, the Papyrus of Ani still guards many secrets. Some hieroglyphs remain ambiguous, resisting definitive translations. Certain passages contain references to religious concepts or ritual practices that are not explained in detail, presumably because they were common knowledge to Ani's contemporaries. One of the greatest enigmas involves the secret formula, mentioned in chapter 162, which promises extraordinary power to the deceased, but whose complete instructions are deliberately omitted. The text states that this knowledge is very secret, and that no eye should see it, no ear should hear it. This intentional self-censorship suggests the existence of an esoteric level of religious knowledge accessible only to initiates. Another persistent mystery is the exact relationship between the text and the illustrations. In some cases, the vignettes seem to directly illustrate the adjacent spells. In others, they seem to tell a parallel or complementary story. Some scholars suggest that the illustrations weren't mere decorations, but active components of the document's magical power, functioning as visual activators of the spells. The question of authorship also remains open. Who wrote and illustrated the Papyrus of Ani? Were they priests, professional scribes, or artists specialized in funerary texts? Did they work from standardized models, or did they have creative freedom? And how do we explain the exceptionally high quality of this particular example? Perhaps the deepest mystery is how the Egyptians themselves interpreted these texts. Did they literally believe that the words and images would guarantee their survival in the afterlife? Or was there a level of metaphorical understanding, an awareness that these texts were symbolic representations of deeper spiritual truths? Some Egyptologists, like Jan Assmann, suggest that the Egyptians themselves maintained a complex and sophisticated relationship with their sacred texts, not one of naive credulity, but of performative belief, where the power of ritual resided not in the literal acceptance of its content, but in the perfection of its execution. The debate about the nature of Egyptian belief continues to be alive in contemporary Egyptology. Would it be anachronistic to project our modern categories of literal versus symbolic onto a culture that possibly didn't make such a distinction? How can we understand a mentality for which magic, religion, and science were not separate domains, but interconnected aspects of a single coherent worldview? The Papyrus of Ani also confronts us with profound philosophical questions about our own mortality. In an age of growing secularism, where many have abandoned traditional beliefs in the afterlife, what can we learn from the Egyptian approach? Their meticulous concern with preparation for the afterlife seems simultaneously strange and deeply familiar, a reminder of our own existential anxiety. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Papyrus of Ani is precisely this: its ability to make us question our own assumptions about life, death, and transcendence. As we contemplate its stunning images and decipher its enigmatic texts, we are invited to consider not only how the ancient Egyptians faced the ultimate mystery of existence, but how we ourselves face it. The Papyrus of Ani, with all its beauty and complexity, remains a testimony to the human attempt to find meaning in the face of the inevitability of death. Its yellowed pages remind us that, despite all our technological sophistication, we continue to ask the same fundamental questions that our ancestors asked millennia ago. And as the Papyrus of Ani rests in its climate-controlled display case at the British Museum, visited annually by millions of people, it continues to fulfill, in a way, its original function, ensuring the immortality of its owner. For as long as this extraordinary document continues to fascinate and inspire, the name of Ani, that royal scribe who lived more than 3,000 years ago, will remain alive in our collective memory. What other secrets does the Papyrus of Ani still guard, waiting for new technologies or perspectives to reveal them? And what do these ancient texts still have to teach us about our own journey through life and beyond? Have you ever wondered, if you could create your own Book of the Dead, what spells would you include for your final journey?